The CEO searched a single dad's bag. One item inside silenced her entire jet. The moment the chief executive asked security to open the worn travel bag of a quiet single father, every conversation inside the private jet came to an abrupt stop. Curious eyes followed every movement as passengers silently wondered what could possibly be hidden inside. Some expected trouble. Others expected embarrassment. No one expected the simple object that would change the atmosphere of the entire cabin in a single heartbeat. Before we continue this unforgettable story of quiet courage, dignity, and unexpected truth, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Share your city or country in the comments below so we can welcome friends from around the world. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories that remind us kindness is always stronger than judgment, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story. Your support means more than you know and helps us continue bringing meaningful, unforgettable journeys to viewers everywhere. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let us return to Nathan Brooks and discover why one ordinary travel bag left an entire private jet in complete silence. Open the bag, the chief executive said in a calm but unmistakably firm voice, and within seconds, every quiet conversation inside the private jet faded into complete silence. Flight attendants paused in the aisle. Business executives looked up from their tablets. The cabin door remained open as warm Texas sunlight streamed across the polished floor, illuminating rows of cream leather seats and polished walnut tables that reflected the golden morning light. Nathan Brooks stood near the entrance with one hand holding the handle of a faded canvas travel bag and the other gently wrapped around the small hand of his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. She looked up at her father with nervous eyes, but did not say a word. Nathan simply smiled at her with the same peaceful expression he had worn since arriving at the private terminal nearly 20 minutes earlier. Across from him stood Victoria Hayes, the respected chief executive officer of Hayes Global Aviation, whose company owned one of the largest fleets of executive aircraft in the country. She was known for demanding excellence, expecting discipline, and never compromising on passenger safety. Earlier that morning, a member of the ground crew had quietly informed her that an unfamiliar passenger carrying an unusually worn travel bag had boarded just before departure. The report itself contained nothing alarming, yet Victoria believed every concern deserved attention. "Sir," she said respectfully, "before we close the cabin door, I need to inspect your bag." Nathan met her eyes without the slightest trace of irritation. "If that helps everyone feel safe," he replied softly, "you are welcome to look inside." His calm answer surprised several passengers who had expected an argument. Sophie gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "did we do something wrong?" Nathan knelt until they were at eye level. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people have responsibilities that require difficult decisions. We should always respect that." His quiet words carried only a few feet through the cabin, yet somehow they seemed louder than the conversations that had filled it only moments before. Victoria noticed the little girl's trust in her father, but professionalism kept her focused. She accepted the bag and carefully placed it on an empty leather seat near the front of the aircraft. The canvas showed years of careful use. The corners were worn smooth, and the brass zipper had lost much of its shine. It looked nothing like the expensive designer luggage stacked neatly in the overhead compartments. One passenger quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "That bag has probably traveled farther than most people." Another executive folded his newspaper, unable to hide his curiosity. Outside the cabin windows, baggage handlers completed the final loading while the distant hum of auxiliary power units blended with the soft breeze crossing the private ramp. Inside, every movement became deliberate. Victoria slowly unfastened the zipper while Nathan rested one reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. He never looked anxious. He never looked offended. He simply waited with remarkable patience, as though he already understood that truth never needed to hurry. Victoria lifted the top flap and glanced inside. The first thing she saw was not anything suspicious at all. It was a neatly folded child's sweater resting carefully beside a lunch container, a well-used coloring book, and a family photograph tucked gently into the side pocket. She paused for only a second before reaching deeper into the bag. where her fingertips touched the edge of a small, weathered wooden box that seemed strangely out of place among such ordinary belongings, and something about its unexpected weight made her stop breathing for just a moment. Victoria kept one hand resting lightly on the weathered wooden box without opening it immediately. Something about its careful placement among the ordinary belongings made her hesitate. The cabin remained unusually quiet as morning sunlight filtered through the oval windows, casting soft reflections across polished wood trim and brushed metal fixtures. The gentle hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power system filled the silence while passengers exchanged curious glances without speaking aloud. Nathan remained exactly where he was, his hand resting reassuringly on Sophie's shoulder. His posture was relaxed, his breathing steady, as though patience had become second nature long before this morning. Sophie looked from the wooden box to her father. "Daddy, is she going to open it?" she asked softly. Nathan smiled with quiet warmth. "If she needs to, sweetheart. Does it bother you?" Sophie continued. Nathan gently shook his head. Trust grows when people are allowed to ask honest questions. His answer caught the attention of a nearby flight attendant, who lowered her eyes thoughtfully before returning to her position beside the cabin door. Victoria looked at Nathan for a brief moment. She had expected frustration, perhaps even embarrassment, yet neither appeared on his face. Instead, she saw the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and no desire to prove anything. Carefully, she lifted the wooden box from the bag. It was surprisingly solid for its size, handcrafted from dark walnut with softened corners polished smooth by years of careful handling. A small brass latch secured the lid, and faint scratches across the surface suggested it had traveled thousands of miles. There were no decorative carvings, no expensive branding, only quiet craftsmanship and years of faithful use. One executive seated near the front leaned slightly into the aisle. "That looks old," he whispered to the passenger beside him. Another nodded. Old things usually carry important stories. Victoria heard neither comment. Her attention remained fixed on the box resting in her hands. She noticed that Nathan watched Sophie instead of the inspection. He quietly adjusted the sleeve of her sweater before brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Sophie smiled. "A little." Nathan pointed toward the lunch container still resting inside the open bag. "Good thing we packed sandwiches." She laughed softly, and for just a moment the tension inside the cabin eased. The simple exchange reminded several passengers that before them stood not a suspicious traveler, but an ordinary father caring for his daughter with remarkable gentleness. Outside the aircraft, a fuel truck slowly rolled away from the wing while a line technician completed the final walk-around inspection beneath the bright Texas sky. Everything about departure remained on schedule except the unusual stillness inside the cabin. Victoria ran her fingertips lightly across the brass latch. She realized she had inspected countless bags throughout her career whenever security required it, yet none had made her hesitate quite like this one. There was something deeply personal about the care with which the box had been packed. It was not hidden. It was protected. Nathan finally spoke, his voice as calm as before. "Whatever you find inside," he said quietly, "please remember that some things carry value beyond money." Victoria slowly looked up to meet his eyes. There was no challenge in his words, only quiet sincerity. She nodded respectfully before returning her attention to the small wooden box. Taking a slow breath, she released the worn brass latch with the tip of her thumb. The soft metallic click echoed through the silent cabin far louder than anyone expected, and at that exact moment the cockpit door opened as the senior captain stepped into the aisle, his eyes immediately falling upon the familiar box resting in the chief executive officer's hands. The senior captain stopped so abruptly that the cockpit door drifted shut behind him with a soft click. His eyes remained fixed on the weathered walnut box resting in Victoria Hayes's hands. The calm confidence he had carried through the pre-flight briefing vanished almost instantly, replaced by quiet disbelief. The passengers noticed the sudden change in his expression before anyone understood the reason. Victoria looked toward him with polite curiosity. "Captain Reynolds," she said, "is everything all right?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, never taking his eyes off the box. "May I see that for a moment?" he asked in a voice noticeably softer than before. Victoria carefully handed it to him. The captain accepted it with both hands, almost instinctively, as though handling something far more precious than its simple appearance suggested. He gently brushed his thumb across the worn brass latch and the smooth walnut surface, studying details that everyone else had overlooked. Nathan watched quietly from his place beside Sophie. He showed no surprise, only the same patient expression that had never changed since boarding. Sophie looked up at her father. "Does he know the box?" she whispered. Nathan smiled gently. He might know the story behind it. Captain Reynolds slowly opened the lid. Inside rested a neatly folded piece of deep blue velvet protecting a polished silver aircraft compass, its glass face still remarkably clear despite its age. Beside it lay a small engraved metal wing insignia and a handwritten note folded with extraordinary care. Nothing glittered with luxury. Nothing appeared expensive. Yet the captain drew a slow breath the instant he saw the compass. His hands became perfectly still. Around the cabin, passengers leaned forward ever so slightly, sensing that something far more significant than a routine inspection was unfolding. Before them, a flight attendant quietly covered her mouth, not because she recognized the objects, but because she recognized the captain's reaction. During nearly 3 decades in aviation, she had never seen him look shaken. Victoria glanced from the compass to the captain. "What is it?" she asked. He remained silent for another long moment before carefully lifting the compass from its velvet lining. The polished silver reflected the warm morning sunlight streaming through the windows, revealing a small inscription engraved around its edge. Captain Reynolds read the words almost in a whisper. "For those who guide others home." His voice carried gently through the cabin. Nathan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as though hearing those words awakened memories too personal to explain. Sophie reached for his hand. He squeezed it reassuringly. Victoria looked back into the box. "Is this some kind of military award?" she asked quietly. Captain Reynolds slowly shook his head. "No." He swallowed before continuing. "It is much rarer than that." Every passenger remained completely silent. Even the soft sounds of luggage settling in the overhead compartments seemed to disappear beneath the growing anticipation. Outside, the ground crew completed the final paperwork while sunlight shimmered across the polished fuselage of the jet. Inside, time itself appeared to slow. Captain Reynolds carefully unfolded the handwritten note, but paused before reading it. Instead, his eyes lifted toward Nathan with unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "I never imagined I would meet you this way." Several passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Victoria's composed expression finally gave way to genuine curiosity. "You know him?" she asked. The captain nodded without hesitation. His answer came quietly, yet every word seemed to fill the cabin. "Not personally," he replied. "But every pilot who has flown this aircraft safely knows his work, even if they have never known his face." Victoria Hayes remained motionless as Captain Reynolds carefully lowered the silver compass back into its velvet lining. The polished cabin had become so quiet that the faint hum of the environmental system seemed louder than before. Sunlight poured through the oval windows, painting soft golden reflections across the walnut table where the weathered wooden box rested open. Every passenger watched without speaking, sensing that they had stepped into a story much larger than a routine security inspection. Victoria finally broke the silence. "What do you mean every pilot knows his work?" she asked quietly. Captain Reynolds looked toward Nathan with deep respect before answering. "About 11 years ago, a team of engineers developed an emergency navigation backup that could continue guiding an aircraft even after multiple primary systems failed. It was never designed for recognition. It was designed so families could make it home safely." He paused briefly before continuing. The lead engineer behind that project was Nathan Brooks. A wave of astonishment passed silently through the cabin. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. One passenger slowly lowered the financial magazine he had been reading since boarding. A flight attendant instinctively straightened her uniform, suddenly realizing she had been standing only a few feet away from someone whose work had protected thousands of flights without ever seeking attention. Victoria looked back at Nathan. "You designed that system?" she asked. Nathan offered a modest smile. "I was fortunate to work with an extraordinary team." Captain Reynolds gently shook his head. "That is exactly what everyone who worked with him always said he would answer." Sophie looked proudly at her father before whispering, "Daddy never likes taking all the credit." Nathan chuckled softly. Because no one builds anything meaningful alone. His words settled gently throughout the cabin. Outside, a line technician removed the final wheel chocks while a marshaller waited patiently beside the aircraft, unaware that departure had been delayed not by a mechanical issue, but by a lesson in humility unfolding inside the cabin. Victoria carefully studied the handwritten note still resting inside the wooden box. "May I read it?" she asked. Nathan nodded without hesitation. She unfolded the aged paper with great care. The handwriting was elegant but slightly faded with time. It read, "If this compass is ever found in your hands again, remember that the greatest purpose of any journey is bringing someone safely home. Never measure success by applause. Measure it by the lives that continue because you quietly did the right thing." No signature appeared beneath the message. Victoria slowly folded the note again, her expression softer than it had been all morning. "Who wrote this?" she asked. Nathan looked down at the compass for a long moment before answering. "My wife." Sophie's fingers gently wrapped around her father's hand. "Mom gave it to Daddy before his final day at the engineering center," she said with innocent pride. She said heroes do not always sit in the cockpit. No one spoke after that. Even the executives who had silently questioned Nathan's appearance lowered their eyes, suddenly aware of how easily they had mistaken simplicity for insignificance. Captain Reynolds closed the wooden box with both hands and held it for a respectful moment before returning it to Nathan. As their hands briefly met, the captain smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. Nathan looked surprised. "For what?" The captain glanced toward the cockpit, then toward every passenger seated behind him. "For helping countless strangers arrive home safely without ever expecting them to know your name." Victoria quietly drew a slow breath as those words settled over the cabin. And for the first time that morning, she realized the most valuable thing inside the worn canvas bag had never been the compass itself, but the quiet life of service it represented. The quiet that followed seemed to settle over every seat in the cabin like a gentle snowfall. No one reached for a phone. No one returned to a laptop or resumed a conversation. The executives who had boarded expecting another routine business flight now found themselves reflecting on a man who had changed aviation without ever introducing himself. Nathan carefully accepted the wooden box from Captain Reynolds and placed the silver compass back inside, with the same care someone might use when protecting a treasured family memory rather than a valuable possession. He closed the lid, fastened the worn brass latch, and returned the box to the faded canvas bag beside Sophie's sweater and lunch container. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply packed everything exactly as it had been before the inspection began. Victoria watched every movement. The contrast between the importance of the items and the simplicity with which Nathan handled them unsettled her more than any discovery she had ever made in her career. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "why carry something so meaningful in an ordinary travel bag?" Nathan smiled gently as he zipped the bag closed. "Because the memories inside are important to me, not because I expect strangers to recognize them." Sophie looked proudly at her father. "Daddy says the best things in life are the ones that remind us who we are." Nathan laughed softly. "I may have said something like that once or twice." Several passengers smiled for the first time that morning. The atmosphere inside the cabin gradually softened, replacing curiosity with quiet admiration. A senior executive seated across the aisle removed his designer briefcase from the seat beside him and placed it on the floor. "Would you and your daughter like to sit here instead?" he asked warmly. "There is more room by the window." Nathan thanked him sincerely, but gently shook his head. "These seats are perfectly comfortable. We are grateful to be here." The executive nodded with new respect, realizing that contentment often belonged to people who expected the least. Outside the aircraft, the final baggage cart pulled away while sunlight reflected brilliantly across the polished fuselage. Ground personnel exchanged routine hand signals, unaware that the greatest lesson of the morning had unfolded inside the cabin instead of on the runway. Victoria remained standing beside Nathan. Her voice was noticeably different now, carrying warmth where formality had existed only minutes earlier. "I have spent years teaching leaders to recognize talent," she admitted. "Today I realized how easily appearances can distract us from genuine character." Nathan met her eyes kindly. "We all learn that lesson more than once." She looked toward Sophie. "I imagine your daughter learns many things from watching you." Nathan glanced lovingly at his little girl before answering. I hope she learns that people deserve kindness before they deserve judgment. Sophie squeezed his hand. Mom used to say that kindness always arrives first. Nathan nodded quietly. She did. Captain Reynolds looked toward Victoria before speaking in a voice only she could hear. Do you understand now why I recognize the compass? Victoria nodded slowly. I understand the compass, she answered. I am still trying to understand the man carrying it. The captain smiled gently. Then you have already started. Victoria remained thoughtful for several seconds before making a decision. She turned toward the lead flight attendant. Please hold departure for another few minutes. The attendant looked surprised. Is there a problem? Victoria glanced back at Nathan and Sophie with quiet determination. No, she replied softly. There is simply something this entire cabin deserves to hear before we take off. Victoria stepped into the center of the aisle and looked slowly around the cabin before speaking. Her confident executive voice remained steady, yet there was an unmistakable humility that had not been there when the morning began. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, before we depart, I believe every person on this aircraft deserves to understand why Captain Reynolds reacted the way he did. No one interrupted. Tablets remained closed. Coffee cups rested untouched on polished tables. Even the crew members stood quietly, waiting to hear what would follow. Victoria turned toward Nathan with genuine respect. Would you allow me to share what the captain told me? Nathan gave a small nod. If it helps someone remember the importance of the people behind the work, then yes. Captain Reynolds smiled appreciatively before continuing the story himself. More than a decade ago, he began, our industry faced a serious challenge. Aircraft systems had become increasingly sophisticated, but engineers recognized that technology still needed one more dependable layer of protection if multiple navigation systems ever became unavailable. A small team was asked to solve a problem many believed could not be solved. He paused as several passengers listened intently. Nathan Brooks led that engineering effort with remarkable patience. He never chased headlines. He never cared about recognition. He cared about making certain that when families boarded an airplane, they had one more invisible safeguard helping them reach home. Nathan lowered his eyes, uncomfortable hearing praise directed toward himself. Sophie looked up at him with quiet admiration. Daddy worked late sometimes, she said softly, but Mom always told me he was helping people he would probably never meet. Nathan gently smiled at the memory. Your mother understood the purpose better than I ever could. Captain Reynolds continued. The project took years of testing. Hundreds of engineers contributed ideas. Thousands of simulations were completed. Every improvement was debated, measured, and refined because failure was never an acceptable outcome when human lives depended upon the result. The captain looked directly at Nathan before adding, when the system was finally certified, many executives celebrated the achievement. Nathan quietly thanked every technician, every mechanic, every software developer, and every test pilot before leaving the stage without asking for a single interview. Several passengers exchanged thoughtful glances. One executive quietly whispered, that explains why none of us recognized him. Victoria nodded. Success often speaks the loudest when it chooses not to introduce itself. Nathan looked toward the bright windows where the Texas sunlight reflected across the wing. His voice became softer than anyone had yet heard. Not long after the project was completed, my wife became seriously ill. Suddenly, every business meeting, every promotion, and every professional award seemed much smaller than helping Sophie through each day. He gently rested his hand on his daughter's shoulder. After my wife passed away, I realized Sophie needed a father more than the aviation industry needed another engineer. So I stepped away. The cabin remained completely still. There was no pity in the silence. Only deep respect. Sophie smiled gently at her father. He never complains, she said. He just makes pancakes every Saturday because Mom used to do that. A few passengers quietly smiled through glistening eyes. Nathan chuckled softly. Mine are never quite as good as hers. Captain Reynolds folded his hands respectfully. Many people believed Nathan disappeared from aviation. The truth is he simply chose the most important assignment of his life. Victoria looked from Nathan to Sophie and finally understood that the worn canvas bag, the homemade lunch, the coloring book, and the treasured wooden box were not signs of a forgotten past. They were the quiet evidence of a man who had willingly exchanged public recognition for the privilege of raising his daughter with dignity, grace, and unwavering love. Nathan's words lingered in the quiet cabin long after he had finished speaking. No one seemed eager for the engines to start anymore. The delay that had once felt inconvenient had quietly become meaningful. Victoria Hayes stood motionless for a moment, her eyes resting on the father and daughter she had nearly reduced to nothing more than a routine security concern. Then, without hesitation, she walked toward Nathan until only a few feet separated them. "Mr. Brooks," she said gently, "I owe you an apology." Every passenger watched in respectful silence. Victoria took a slow breath before continuing. "When you boarded this aircraft, I looked at your worn bag before I looked at your character. I saw what appeared ordinary without considering that extraordinary people rarely announce themselves." Nathan offered the same calm smile he had worn since the beginning of the morning. "You were doing your job," he answered kindly. "Safety matters." Victoria slowly shook her head. "Safety matters, but so does dignity. I should have remembered both." Nathan nodded with quiet understanding. "We all have moments that remind us to slow down." Sophie looked up at Victoria with innocent curiosity. "Are you sad?" she asked softly. A gentle smile crossed Victoria's face. "A little," she admitted. "Mostly because I almost forgot something important." Sophie tilted her head. "What was it?" Victoria glanced toward Nathan before answering. "That every person has a story I cannot see." The little girl smiled. "Daddy tells me that all the time." Several passengers quietly smiled at her simple wisdom. Captain Reynolds folded his hands behind his back, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. He understood that some lessons could never be taught in a training manual. They had to be experienced. Victoria turned back toward Nathan. "May I ask you one question?" Nathan nodded. "Of course. After everything you accomplished, after all the recognition you could have received, do you ever regret stepping away?" Nathan looked at Sophie before answering. The little girl was carefully placing her coloring book back into the canvas bag, humming softly to herself, completely unaware that an entire cabin of accomplished professionals had been changed simply by watching her father. Nathan's eyes reflected quiet gratitude. "Not for a single day," he replied. "Airplanes help people reach destinations. Raising my daughter helped me discover my own." The cabin remained completely silent. Those simple words carried more weight than any corporate speech many of the passengers had heard in years. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "I spend my life measuring performance, efficiency, and results," she admitted. "Perhaps I have forgotten that the greatest success cannot always be measured." Nathan answered gently. "The people we love usually keep the best score." Sophie slipped her small hand into her father's again. "Daddy says I am his favorite project." Nathan laughed quietly. "And also my most challenging supervisor." Soft laughter spread through the cabin, breaking the remaining tension without diminishing the sincerity of the moment. Victoria smiled warmly before extending her hand. Nathan accepted it with quiet respect. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at being proven right. Only grace. As their hands met, Nathan spoke one sentence that settled deeply into every heart on board. "My daughter is always watching how I treat people," he said softly. "Long after she forgets what I accomplished, I hope she remembers how I responded when someone misunderstood me." No one replied, because everyone in the cabin realized that Sophie had not been the only one learning from Nathan Brooks that morning. The lead flight attendant received a quiet signal from Victoria Hayes and closed the cabin door with a gentle pull. Outside, the ground crew stepped away from the aircraft while the engines slowly came to life with a steady, reassuring hum. Yet before Captain Reynolds requested clearance to depart, Victoria picked up the cabin intercom one final time. Her voice traveled evenly through every speaker, carrying neither corporate authority nor polished confidence, but sincere conviction. "Before we leave today," she said, "I want to share something that this morning has reminded me." Every passenger looked toward her. Hayes Global Aviation has always promised excellence in safety, service, and innovation. Beginning today, we will add another promise. Every employee, every passenger, every visitor, and every member of our team deserves to be treated with respect before assumptions are ever made. The words settled gently across the cabin. Several executives nodded without speaking. They understood that this was more than an announcement. It was the beginning of a cultural change. Victoria continued. When we judge someone by appearance before character, we do not simply risk making an incorrect decision. We risk overlooking the very people whose quiet contributions make our world safer and stronger. She lowered the microphone and looked toward Nathan. Thank you for reminding me of that. Nathan inclined his head respectfully. Thank you for being willing to learn it, he replied. Captain Reynolds smiled as he returned to the cockpit. Moments later, the aircraft began to taxi smoothly across the sunlit ramp. Sophie pressed her face gently against the window, watching baggage carts and service vehicles move across the busy airport. Daddy, she whispered happily. The airplanes look smaller when we are inside one. Nathan smiled. Sometimes perspective changes everything. She thought about that for a moment before nodding, as though she understood more than her years suggested. Across the aisle, one executive quietly removed a gold fountain pen from his jacket pocket and wrote a single sentence across the top of his notebook before closing it again. Another passenger placed his expensive watch back beneath his shirt cuff, suddenly embarrassed by how much attention he usually gave to appearances. The flight attendants resumed their service with noticeably warmer smiles, greeting each passenger with renewed attentiveness that felt less like routine hospitality and more like genuine human kindness. As the aircraft reached the runway, Captain Reynolds announced their departure clearance. The engines increased smoothly, pressing everyone gently into their seats as the jet accelerated beneath the bright Texas sky. Within moments, the wheels lifted from the ground, and the city slowly unfolded beneath them like a carefully painted landscape. Sunlight filled the cabin with a warm golden glow. Sophie laughed softly as clouds drifted past her window. Nathan looked outside for a brief moment before quietly closing his eyes in gratitude. Victoria remained seated across the aisle, reflecting on everything that had happened in less than an hour. She opened her tablet and began drafting the first revision to the company's leadership handbook. The opening sentence came easily. Respect must always arrive before assumption. She paused before adding a second sentence. Character cannot be measured by appearance, possessions, or status. It is revealed only through patience, humility, and grace. She saved the document without changing another word. For the first time in many years, the policy she had written was not inspired by a business consultant, a board meeting, or a legal recommendation. It had been inspired by a quiet single father carrying an old canvas bag, a little girl holding his hand, and a simple reminder that the strongest leaders are often the ones who never ask to be noticed. At 38,000 feet, the world below had disappeared beneath an endless blanket of white clouds, leaving only brilliant sunlight stretching across the wings of the aircraft. The cabin had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Soft conversations had returned, coffee was being served, and the quiet tension that had greeted the morning had been replaced by something far more lasting. Sophie had fallen asleep beside the window with her small blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders, her coloring book resting on her lap, and one hand still gently touching the worn canvas bag at her feet. Nathan looked at her with the unmistakable expression of a father who understood that life had already given him more than he had ever expected. Victoria Hayes quietly walked down the aisle carrying the weathered wooden box in both hands. She had asked the flight attendant for a soft polishing cloth, not to make the box appear newer, but simply to remove the fingerprints left during the inspection. She stopped beside Nathan's seat and waited until he looked up. Without saying anything at first, she carefully placed the wooden box into his hands exactly as he had packed it earlier that morning. "I wanted to return it properly," she said softly. Nathan looked at the box before meeting her eyes. "Thank you." Victoria smiled gently. "No," she replied. "Thank you for reminding me that some of the greatest treasures people carry cannot be measured by what they cost." Nathan carefully slipped the box back into the canvas bag beside Sophie's sweater, lunch container, and family photograph. He zipped the bag closed with the same quiet care as before. Nothing about his movements suggested he believed the morning had been about proving anyone wrong. He had simply protected what mattered most. Victoria remained standing beside him for another moment. "I hope we meet again someday," she said. Nathan smiled warmly. "If we do, I hope it is because our paths naturally cross, not because my bag needs another inspection." Victoria laughed softly, and for the first time that day the laughter came without embarrassment. "I believe I have learned enough to avoid repeating that mistake." Captain Reynolds stepped briefly out of the cockpit before returning for the descent briefing. As he passed Nathan's seat, he paused and offered a respectful nod that required no words. Nathan returned the gesture with quiet gratitude. Across the cabin, several passengers who had never spoken to Nathan before quietly smiled as their eyes met his. They no longer saw an ordinary traveler carrying an old bag. They saw a father who had chosen love over recognition, humility over applause, and character over reputation. Sophie stirred gently in her sleep, smiling faintly without waking. Nathan carefully adjusted the edge of her blanket and looked out the window at the endless sky. He thought about his wife, about the promise she had written beside the silver compass, and about the thousands of strangers whose lives had unknowingly intersected with his own. Yet the accomplishment that filled his heart most completely was sleeping peacefully beside him, trusting without question that her father would always be there when she opened her eyes. High above the clouds, the engines carried the aircraft steadily toward its destination, but the greatest journey had already taken place inside the hearts of everyone on board. The inspection that began with suspicion had ended with respect. The worn canvas bag that first attracted doubtful attention had quietly become a reminder that true worth is rarely wrapped in impressive appearances. In the end, the most valuable thing Nathan Brooks carried was never the silver compass, the handwritten note, or the remarkable history hidden inside a simple wooden box. The greatest treasure he brought onto that aircraft was the quiet strength of his character. Because possessions can be searched, titles can be forgotten, achievements can fade with time, but a life lived with dignity, grace, and kindness has a way of leaving every heart it touches in grateful silence.